2011 Circling the Wagons Conference was a production of Mormon Stories Podcast and the Open Stories Foundation. For additional Circling the Wagons audio and video, and for additional content regarding LGBT issues within Mormonism, please check out gaymormonstories.org. Also, please know that the video for this conference is available at youtube.com/MormonStories. And thank you for listening.
Now let us rejoice in the day of salvation. No longer as strangers on earth need we roam.
Hello and welcome to this post-potluck interview. My name is John DeLynn with Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm very honored that you'd all be here today to talk and to meet and to learn about Jim Dabakis. How many of you know who Jim Dabakis is? Raise your hand. How many of you have never heard of this guy and wondering why we're interviewing him? Okay. The truth is that most of our listening audience are going to be like the latter of you. I had not heard of Jim Dabakis until a few months ago when Carolyn Pearson emailed me and said, you need to meet this guy. I don't think he had yet ascended to the chairmanship of the Utah Democratic Party at that time, but since he has, as I understand it, the first openly LGBT chairman of the Utah Democratic Party, or probably of any party in Utah. I think so. I don't know how distinguished that is, but it seems really distinguished to me. Also, some of you may know that in Salt Lake City, they passed some very pro-LGBT or anti-discriminatory legislation to support our LGBT citizens in Salt Lake, and that couldn't have been done in Utah without the support of the LDS Church. And there are a group of several men, I've heard it described as the Gang of Five. I don't know what that means or who the other four might be. But Jim was one of those people who in a very diplomatic and respectful way engaged in a respectful conversation with the LDS Church leadership and worked to help affect that change, which I think is going to bless the lives of many people. So that's why we have Jim Dabakis here. He also has a Mormon story, or a semi-Mormon story. We'll find out how Mormon that story is. But Jim Dabakis, welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
All right. So, where were you born?
In Massachusetts.
All right. What part?
Springfield. It's in the western part. It's the part that's not Boston, the part nobody's ever been to.
Okay. What did your parents do for a living?
My dad worked in a factory, and my mom took care of the house.
All right.
Kind of.
Okay. No digs on moms. They do the best they can. Any siblings?
3 sisters.
Okay.
Some people say 4 sisters, but...
Any sort of noteworthy dynamics in your childhood, moments of stress or of joy, of triumph, of pain that you see as kind of defining who you are today?
You know, I think I'm going to answer all the questions yes and no, and we can wrap this up. Events in my childhood. Well, my childhood was a little bit grim. Our town was grim. It's one of those eastern kind of factory towns that lost their factories, and there was a lot of boarded up places, and there weren't very many jobs, and my dad was always, he worked at a factory, but they were sometimes on strike or they wouldn't have enough stuff. And I remember as a little kid, at Christmas time, somebody had some do-gooder had left a big Christmas thing in front of our front door. And rather than being grateful, I was humiliated that people thought we were poor to be having left that. But there was never enough money, and my mother she's passed away, but she had some mental illness problems and was difficult. She spent 7 or 8 years locked in her room, more or less, as I was growing up. So it was a difficult time for us. For me.
I see. That sounds hard. Since this is a conference about supporting our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters, do you remember a time in your childhood where you first started thinking you were different? And if so, talk about that.
This is about gay stuff?
Sorry, a little bit.
All right. Actually, one of the first things well, the story just flashed in my mind that I won't tell, but but I will tell. When I was 11 years old, about 4 or 5 houses down, the missionaries converted a family, and somehow or another, the missionaries were led over to our house, maybe divine inspiration, maybe not, and they found this 11-year-old kid, me, and times were grim, I think, for baptisms, and so they told me about a basketball team they had, and they could see, because I had been playing basketball, I wasn't very good and probably couldn't play on any other teams, but I was tall. I was taller than all the other 11-year-olds. So anyway, they brought me to church. That was my first contact with the LDS church. And I played basketball, and I was okay for the ward team, for the branch team it was then. And we would play all the other branches around, but they weren't close. I mean, we would go New Haven, which was maybe an hour, or different places. So every game was an experience, and pretty soon I really got to enjoy playing basketball, and I got to play, which was unique for me. And about 6-7 months into this process, the LDS Church had a rule then, which was there could only be one non-Mormon playing on the basketball court at a time. And so at that time, a guy named Richie Page, who also wasn't a Mormon and who was taller than me and a much better player, started playing. And so I stopped playing. I didn't stop. They wouldn't, I couldn't play. So the coach came over one day, old brother Healy, and he said, look, there is a way you could play, Jim. So I went home to my mom and I said, Mom, I'm going to become a baptism and become a Mormon. And she said, what? And I said, yeah, it's no big deal. And she said, all right, but don't tell your father and be home by 5. So I remember, and maybe it was the missionaries or the baptism, or maybe, I don't know what it was, but in those days, the missionaries had these ramblers, because I think old brother Romney was the head of American Motors, and they probably got him a good deal, but I don't know that. So these 2 hunky missionaries put me right in the middle as this 11-year-old, and we drove off to the church to get baptized, and I'd only been there to play basketball. So, and I remember kind of feeling that was kind of nice to be between these 2 missionaries. And we went, got baptized, and got home for dinner, and that was kind of the beginning.
I see. So the Mormon missionaries inspired you in more ways than one.
Exactly. I remember their aftershave. Easterners, at least the Easterners I was around didn't use aftershave. And maybe they were using too much, or I don't know what it was, but I remember sitting there between those missionaries and kind of going and kind of smelling them. Which sounds weird, but I remember that. I was only 11. Give me a break.
So up through the time that you went to college, did you at some point start feeling those feelings stronger, and at some point recognize that you might be gay? That branch in Springfield, Massachusetts, kind of took this kid who really was not. I wasn't functioning very well, actually. And they kind of grabbed me up and did the best thing that LDS people do in branches and wards and whatever. And they kind of mainstreamed me into their organization and into their families and into their hearts. I mean,
most of the good things about that I consider to be good things about my character came from that next 10 years, as they picked me up every single Sunday. They picked me up every Tuesday and every practice. I mean, you're 11, you can't exactly drive, and I used to look forward to Tuesday nights when there was MIA, and it had a dramatic impact on how I grew up and the leadership and a lot of things that happened during that whole period. So the whole experience I look back on as something very good. I kind of knew, to answer your question more directly, I kind of knew there was something a little weird. But that may not have anything to do with being gay. I mean, people still say that about me. It has nothing to do with that.
Right. So you had an inkling, but you were really submersed in the culture, and you kind of went with it during those years.
Yeah, I went with it.
So do you have a soft spot in your heart for your Mormon upbringing then?
I do. I mean, I don't know what would have happened to me if those LDS people were, every summer our bishop had an apple farm, and it was about 40 or 50 miles away. And from the time I was 15, every summer, Bishop Phelan had 12 kids, 11 boys, and they would pick me up kind of the first weekend school got out, and I would stay out in this country place, except I didn't like to work hard. It was a problem on a farm. So my first job was picking blueberries, and that didn't go well because I was eating a lot of them. And so I managed to weasel my way into the packing house because the work was easier. And unlike all the other people that were up there working, I stayed in the house with a Phelan family, but they were just one of just many people in the branch that just kind of took care of me.
Did you ever feel like you had a traditional LDS testimony of the truthfulness of the church and kind of spiritual manifestations about its truthfulness?
That's a good question. I think less than others, but I kind of went with it. I didn't have that kind of Saul on the road kind of experience, but I kind of liked it.
College, where'd you go?
Massachusetts, there's not a lot of good schools, so I went to BYU.
How'd that go? Now, what years would have that been?
1971, I arrived at BYU.
So Wilkinson was still there?
No, that was Oaks' first year.
Oh,
yeah,
really? Okay.
I missed Wilkinson. So I do remember this. I remember getting there, and I drove a car, this 15-year-old Ford Galaxy, and drove it across, and it barely made it. And I loved college. I enjoyed every minute of it. I enjoyed the friendships. But I can remember thinking, look at this. All of my friends, all of these fantastic people that I know, they're slowly getting paired up, and what's going to happen to me? I'm going to be the only one left here. So that was a little bit grim.
Did you serve a mission?
Yes.
In between that?
I went to school for a year, and then my patriarchal blessing said that I would be called to serve among my people. So being Greek, they sent me to San Francisco. Actually fulfilling the prophecy in the patriarchal blessing.
So, did you happen to find a Greek population in?
Oh no.
No.
Well, we eat in a Greek restaurant occasionally, but I do remember saying to our mission president, we were in an elevator one time, and I enjoy being a wise ass, at least occasionally. And our mission president was not exactly. He was I really liked him, but he not much of a sense of humor. So we got in this elevator in San Francisco, and I said, I was a district leader or something, and he said, well, Elder, how's it going? And I said, President, we've had a lot of problems. There's a lot of sexual immorality. There's homosexuals everywhere. There's non-believers. And he pulled his glasses off, and I said, and President, that's just among the missionaries. And not a crack, nothing, just put his glasses back on, and we walked out like nothing had happened, But it was fun to go there. I mean, I was, tracting in Berkeley in the early 70s and in San Francisco at Ashbury, and,
Those are fun times.
It was a great time.
So you enjoyed your mission overall?
I loved every minute of it. I didn't like the tracting thing. It just seemed to me to be not very cost effective. So I tried to come up with options. So I remember we would try to come up with different ways to not do what we were supposed to do, but still not necessarily cheat with what we were saying. So you were supposed to contact X number of people or do things. So I remember going into the Safeways in San Francisco and going to the meat department with my companion, and we would hold up a piece of beef and wait for just the right housewife to come along and say, ma'am, how would you exactly cook this? And, just trying not to knock on doors, which seemed useless.
Right.
I enjoyed it. And then they brought me to the mission home. They were desperate. They didn't know what to do with me. So the president said, okay, this was the new president, I want you to be an assistant, but I realize that we'll have Elder Nelson do the praying. You can be in charge of other things. What did that mean?
It meant you gave irreverent prayers. Is what it meant.
So one of my first tasks was, again, it seemed to me that we ought to be doing things that were more effective. And I got bored easy. So there was a guy named Jeff Mullins. Any NBA fans here? Jeff Mullins was a basketball player for the Warriors, which is the team in San Francisco. It's actually in Oakland, but. So one way or another, by hook or by crook, I ended up at his house, and he invited us in, and so they were never going to join the church, but I liked going over and visiting, and it was fun. So I went to the mission president and to the stake presidents, and we came up with this idea to have a special presentation at halftime at one of the Golden State Warriors games, and they were very pleased with that because 3,000 Mormons would be coming to a game and paying for the tickets. So the basketball team was excited about it. And so I worked for a month getting everything ready, getting the word out, getting the tickets sold, working with the management, plus I didn't have to track. I could go down there and watch the basketball practice and go in the locker room, and strictly for professional reasons. So as all that happened, finally the night arrived, and what we were going to do is give away something kind of new then, a family home evening manual, which seems like a good idea now. But looking back on it, I should have looked through the program a little better because, here's what happened. It's halftime, and the PA guy came down, and the person right before me was a guy, it was an appliance store. And so back in those days, you had tickets with a little number on it. And so the way they would decide a winner is they would read off the ticket number, and then that person, they put a spotlight on it, and that person would run down and get this. So if you can imagine this, ladies and gentlemen, we're now going to give away a new washer and dryer. And so they read that, and the spotlight found the person, and they came running down and got their washer and dryer. And then it was a Volkswagen car they gave away. Well, then my mission president read off the number while I was standing there, and this black woman from the very top won, and she went crazy. And the spotlight went on her and followed her as she was a bit overweight. As she ran all the way down, she got to the floor, and the stake president handed her this family home evening manual. She said, "What's this shit? I don't want this shit." And the guy was going, "Kill the mic, kill the mic." So from there, I got transferred to Los Banos, which is at the far southern part of the mission.
Got it. All right. So some fun mission experiences. Did you convert anybody on your mission? Have any success?
Yes, I did, and I've gone back and seen some of the people, and they seem to be doing fine.
So what'd you study at BYU?
Communications.
All right. Did you date at BYU at all?
Boys or girls? Oh. Yeah, I did.
This was the time where reparative therapy was happening.
They tried to get me to go to that, and I told them they were full.
So you were there? Were they marketing it? Were they?
Yes.
How would you have heard about it?
Well, because there was I didn't even know there were. I probably would have gone, but I didn't know where there were any gay people. There was no Google apps, so I didn't know what to do. But I did go, as soon as I got there in 1971, so that would have been in August, and in September, I borrowed a friend's car, drove up to Salt Lake, marched into South Temple to the big church office building, and I said, I need to talk to somebody about a problem. And the wise woman there, who's the receptionist, said, "Is this with a girl or a boy?" Which may say something that they were having a lot of people there.
It was the 70s.
Yeah, it was the 70s. And so I said, "It's a boy." And she said, "Okay." And then they brought me up to Elder Mark Peterson of the 12 right there and then. And I went into his office, and I remember he had on his wall
Handcuffs?
Whoa, you better edit that out, bro. He had one of those Book of Mormon paintings that are actually illustrated in the Book of Mormon. It's not handcuffs. And so he talked to me for a couple of minutes, and he was sympathetic, and then he said, "Okay, I'm going to give you a blessing. You're going to go to BYU, and you're going to do fine, and you're never going to have any problems, and you're cured, and you're forgiven, and you don't have to bring this up again. So if your bishop or anybody asks you, you don't have to bring it up, and if anybody asks you and pushes you or do anything, you tell them to come see me." And I thought, "Oh, that's good." And then he gave me a blessing, and I was cured, and it's not much of a story.
Gotcha. So you were fixed. So did you date women at all at BYU?
I did, and it was very uncomfortable. Women are fine, but women at BYU are looking for a husband. And I was looking to escape. I was looking for a husband too.
So you at that point you knew you were gay. Was there even a word for that? I mean, was that something?
Well, it's not that long ago.
Oh,
yeah, no. Yeah, I knew I was gay, and this sounds a little weird. And now that I think back on it, but I had a wonderful roommate there, and well, I'm not going to tell that story. No, that's it. Sorry.
Okay, so I'll ask again. You knew you were gay.
Yeah.
All right. So, did some type of dilemma start happening where you had your beliefs and you had the pressures and you had what you knew you felt inside?
I didn't face a lot of that. I did go see a counselor about the gay stuff, but I don't know how this happened. He was working on his clinical. He was going to be a clinical psychologist, and he was working on his PhD. And he was Jewish from the East. And how he got into BYU, I don't know. And how I got the luck of the draw to get him instead of where else they could have sent me. And I remember him just saying, don't worry about this. His name was Joel. He said, don't worry about this. He said, you're fine. You're a good kid. You're going to get through this. And, we met 2 or 3 times, and that seemed to, be fine with me. I after I got back from my mission, I moved in with the Phelan family right after I decided to leave BYU. And this was my old bishop, so in Pleasant Grove. And I remember thinking, okay, and that was just for a couple of weeks. It was a transition time. And I had gotten an apartment in Salt Lake. And I remember going to a sacrament meeting and looking around and thinking, well, this is it, kind of. This is going to be I remember the first meeting I went to, and this will be my last one. And, it's kind of nice, and I'm enjoying singing. So it wasn't this kind of emotional horror that I know a lot of people have. I mean, it was just like, okay, this has been the phase, and now it's time for a new phase. I'm going to move to Salt Lake, and this is the end of the Mormon story. Guess that kills the interview.
No.
Oh, okay.
No, Mormonism's harder to shake than that.
Oh, okay.
So what age was that?
It's 23.
So at 23, you said, I'm going to make a clean break from the church.
Yeah, and it wasn't gradual. It wasn't, okay, I'm not going to go. I mean, it was, going every week, doing everything, paying the tithing to, okay, that's it. It's over. Goodbye.
What about your beliefs?
I guess I'm schizophrenic. I remember about that time I had read 2 things. Cleon Skousen had been a professor of mine.
Nice.
And he was a charismatic. I mean, he's by far the most entertaining, unforgettable professor I had at BYU. And he was a little bit goofy, but very interesting. And he had started a thing called the Freeman Institute at BYU, which was the beginning kind of Glenn Beckism and this kind of conspiracies and the world is being taken over, and it ties into a lot of somewhat obscure political thoughts. So that was on one hand. I had been studying Skousen. On the other hand, I'd gotten a hold of Fawn Brody's book called No Man Knows My History. And I had decided, putting all this gay stuff aside, it'll just be interesting to intellectually decide if this is really right or not. And I think Brody's book had a big impact on me. So I was able to kind of make that transition relatively seamless.
So maybe you severed your faith ties before you actually severed participation.
Yeah, I would say probably.
Pretty close. Okay. So what was your career, just in general? We won't go deep into it, but prior to getting into politics, kind of what was your career?
Well, I had decided that really there was only one. I didn't like work. I've never really been able to kind of go out there and do stuff for 8 hours, and it just didn't work well for me. So what I really wanted to do was be a talk show host. And this was before talk radio was kind of big. There was only one talk station in Utah, and it turned off at sunset. So, but I had listened to that station, and I decided that was what I was qualified to do, and that's what I wanted to do. So I went up to Salt Lake and talked to the guy who owned the station and said, I would like to work for you. And he said, okay, kid, fill out the paper. I filled out the paper, and then he opened this file, and he put my application in the middle of it. And if I would have given him $1,000, he couldn't have picked that application back out. So I figured, well, chances of him calling me back are not good. So I didn't have anything to do anyway. So I went back the next day, and I said, got past the receptionist, and I said, so Mr. Bush, could I, He said, no, I'll call you. So I went back the 3rd day and the 4th day, and by the 5th or 6th day, they wouldn't let me in the building. So I waited outside and figured out that this was Mr. Bush's Audi, and I waited for him to go to lunch, and I said, Mr. Bush, look, I'll work for free. I'll work on an internship. And he said, what the hell's an internship? And I said, I'll work for free. And he said, well, so there had been a woman named Laura Ferguson who had been on the air. It was the early days of talk radio. It wasn't sophisticated the way it is now. So this woman was a ditz, but a lovable ditz. And men would kind of flirt with her. So this guy had been calling up. She would say, there was no producers. She would answer it live. So Laura would go, okay, let's go to line 1. And this guy would go, and then laugh, and then she would go back, and he kept calling again and again and again. So Starley said, okay, you come in, you answer the phone, and when there's a real human being, then you tell Laura. And so that was my first job in radio. So he said, get there at 11, but I had nothing to do. So I got there at 6 in the morning, and I stayed till they closed the station, and about 4 years later, I was partners with him, and we did well.
And so you started your own radio show.
So after 9 months of working for free, I got a show.
Okay.
You know, yeah.
And so that show dealt with what?
It dealt with gay Mormons. No, it didn't. This was the 70s. So I would usually interview somebody the first hour, politician or historian, or that's where I first got to know Michael Quinn and Trevor Southey, and I would just do an interview usually. If they were good, I'd keep them over a little. If they weren't good, I would dump them, and I would usually tell them that in the beginning, you know. If you're no good, you'll be gone in 10 minutes. So then after that, it was just me and the audience for 3 hours, and it was very enjoyable.
People calling in?
People called in, yeah.
You just talked to them?
Yeah.
And did that turn into a TV show then?
Yes, on Channel 4, I had a show no one watched.
What year was the TV?
On Sunday morning. It was for 4 years. It ended in 1988.
Okay. And what was that about?
That was the same thing, just the two of us talking. So I'd have Larry Miller or Governor Bangerter or the inventor of a yo-yo or, you know, whatever was coming to town.
So were you kind of becoming a bit of a celebrity?
Very little.
Are you being modest? I mean, seriously, did people know you in town?
Not very many, really.
Was it like a VHF, UHF, whatever?
No, Channel 4 is the ABC affiliate.
Okay, so it was a mainstream channel.
Yeah.
Was it just on a funky hour? Or?
What 3 in the morning is not funky. No, I was on like a 9 o'clock Sunday morning, so it was one of those Sunday morning shows. But we really were breaking through. I had the first that I know of panel of drag queens on. We handled the AIDS situation. I remember being furious when Tim Hoover, my friend, was dying of AIDS, and there was not a doctor. Can you imagine this? In our lifetime, doctors would refuse to see him until we came to Dr. Reese, who would see him. They wouldn't even let people with HIV in the early days into their offices. And I had the heads of the medical association on, and so it was a good platform, and I wasn't shy about getting involved with gay issues even then.
So was there a gay underground, or was there a community of people that were trying to support each other and help each other behind the scenes?
There was a wonderful group called Affirmation, which started my social life at this time consisted of the MIA of Tuesday night of my youth had been replaced by we started a group at the University of Utah, which met every Monday night, and then afterwards we'd had speakers, and there would be maybe 10 or 15 or 20 of us, and then we would go to the Village Inn down on 4th South afterwards, and that became a core where I met a lot of wonderful people that continue to be my friends now. We also had a group. We were involved with a guy in Los Angeles called Paul Mortensen in starting a chapter of Affirmation in Salt Lake. But we saw we saw affirmation differently than they did at the other chapters. At the first national conference of affirmation, there was 4 or 5 of us that drove down to LA, and I think we all stayed in Paul's apartment. And the other chapters were insistent on having a prayer to begin our meetings. And the Salt Lake group, we were outraged. We saw it as a social outlet. They saw it as a kind of religious substitute for what they were doing. So there was tension back then. But we'd have 100 or 150 people on Thursday nights in this mostly social group that really, some of my closest friends to this day are from that association. We also had a group called the First Sunday where we would have, but that was much more LDS oriented, where we would have speakers that talked about LDS thing. I remember we had a guy named Mark Hoffman come and talk about all of these manuscripts that were being discovered, and we got a big crowd there, and there was a lot of activity. You know, we were kids kind of, and we were on the emerging front of this whole. The whole world was changing, and we didn't quite realize that, but it was very exciting.
When did you first come out?
I think I came out. I was 23, and I.
Oh wow.
Is that old?
Still in the 70s?
Yeah.
So right when you left BYU, basically.
Yeah, the next weekend I was, out.
So you were an out gay male in Salt Lake City, apostate male in the 70s.
Boy. Yeah. Well, I don't know if I ever became an apostate, but I remember I went to there was a bar called the Radio City. And I had heard that was a gay bar, and I went there, and I went inside. It was on State Street, and I went inside, and it was pretty grim. I was the only person under 70 there. Or maybe it just appeared that way. Now I probably feel comfortable there. But
how'd you get radio and TV jobs as an out gay male in Utah in the 70s and early 80s?
Well, it wasn't that I was out. I wasn't in. I mean, I was.
It just wasn't discussed?
It wasn't discussed. Nobody talked about it. Nobody knew about it. Nobody spoke about it. Even people that knew didn't talk about it.
So you weren't hiding it, but you also weren't talking about it?
Right.
Okay, when did you first start talking about it?
Well, that happened. So I bought into the radio stations, and then we sold the radio stations, and then I went to Russia and lived there and started some businesses. And then when I came back from Russia, Tom Barberi, who was a morning guy on the radio here, would call me in to fill in when he was gone. So I was filling in with a good friend of mine, John Prince, who's a very straight guy we'd worked together at K-Talk. So really the leading morning talk show personality would go away on vacation, and both of us would go fill in for him. So one day we were filling in, and this woman called and said, "Hi, my name is Gail Ruzicka." And I said, "Oh, Gail, hi, how are you?" She said, "Well, don't you think you have an obligation to tell all the audience that you're gay, gay, gay?" So poor John Prince, he went, "Oh, brother." He said, he could see where I was going. And I think he wanted me to say, "No, you're not, I'm not gay." But I said, Gail, I know you're worried about this, but I've seen your husband, and don't worry, he's safe. So let's go to the next caller. And then Clear Channel, being the epitome of strength and valor and courage, never invited John or I back to co-host again. And
what year was this?
So this would have been in about 93 or 4. So then John says that he feels like he was discriminated against for being not gay because he was with a gay guy. Associated.
Guilt by association.
Yeah.
So was that devastating for you? Was it a relief for you? What was it?
It was
a non-event.
It was, it wasn't. it was fun because I was just filling in, you know. And so it might have been 3 or 4 times a year for 2 or 3 days or whatever. So it wasn't as though I had lost my job and lost my dignity and self-respect. It was, oh, well, you know, too bad. And some other radio stations asked me afterwards anyway, so I still had somewhat of a voice, but it felt bad, sure.
But were you ashamed? Were you embarrassed? Was it a weight off your shoulders? Did words start spreading and gossip and, you know, rumor mongering?
Oh, there was probably a little rumor mongering, but you know, I didn't really have family here. There's nobody, almost everybody that really knew me by then knew I was gay. I mean, it wasn't, there was no breakthrough of shame.
Got it. So, before we move into your life as a politician, can you just talk briefly about what tragedy or pain or suffering you saw amongst your gay friends and associates in Utah during those 70s, 80s, and early 90s, and if any of that motivated your desires to be a politician?
There was a young man when I was on the radio, so the mid-70s, probably 76, 77, who was a BYU student, and he had been somehow or another got in a car with a BYU undercover guy, and they went up Provo Canyon, and apparently at some time going up the canyon, and they had met, and I can't remember the circumstances of how or where or whatever, but anyway, they got into this car, and this young man had reached over and touched the knee of this undercover police officer. So that undercover police officer grabbed the kid, brought him to the BYU security, they arrested him, they booked him in the county jail, and he was charged with forcible sexual assault. And he was tried and convicted and went to jail to the point of the mountain. And I remember being furious beyond words. And I took off on the radio every day about how is it that a private university had a public police that could be off campus and could be arresting people and blah, 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 blah. So we went through all of that. And we were an NBC affiliate at that time. The radio station was. That is, we took the news from NBC. So using that as a pretext, I called Dean Cameron, who was the dean of students, and said that I was working on a story for 60 Minutes and I would be down to talk with them, realizing that public relations is important to BYU. So I arrived down there, met with the dean of students, and told him that we were looking into a story about abuses in the BYU security, and I wanted to talk specifically about this case and know if there were any other ones. Luckily, he didn't listen to talk radio, but it had an effect.
Were you fibbing?
Well, everything I said was true, but it was in a very contorted way, the truth. I was working on a story for,
It was truthy.
but they didn't know that I was working on a story for them, and you know, so. So we did have an effect on policy at that time in the 60s, and I was there. I've heard people tell the story, but it's absolutely true. Tim Hoover, who is my great friend, was going to BYU. I had left BYU, but I saw him standing outside the Sun, which was the big nightclub to go to, and they played disco music, and it was cool in the mid-70s. Tim had a hooded sweatshirt on. So I was walking in, he had been a roommate of mine. A gay guy had been my roommate at BYU, I didn't know. So I saw Tim standing out there in the hooded thing, and I went over to him and I said, "Tim," and he said, "Oh yeah." I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, what are you doing here?" I said, "Look, I'm working for BYU security. I have to turn you in." And Tim said, no, you can't. I said, Tim, it's my job. So it was, of course, not true on my part at that moment, but we knew they were doing sweeps of the parking lots, and they were writing down license plate numbers, and that continued beyond the Wilkinson time into the Oaks time, and then running it through to see which BYU students would be called in. So when I was at BYU, I missed all the underground fun stuff. I don't know how, I just was oblivious toward it, and I would have liked it if I would have found it, but I just never was clever enough to figure out what was going on, I guess. Probably I looked too macho, so nobody, no, not that. So, but there was a lot of pain, there was a lot of hurt, and where I saw most of it was in these groups that were in their infancy in Salt Lake at that time, with Affirmation and with the university and in First Sunday and in those groups. And there were suicides, there were bad things.
I guess this is the last question I'll ask. You would think that in Utah, being gay, being somewhat maybe of a bit of a social activist, stirring up a little bit of trouble, that you would have been targeted, that the powerful forces that be would have tried to kind of take you out or marginalize you, and it sounds like you were like Teflon.
I think a couple things. First of all, I was such a small fly that nobody cared. And second, I am not, even now, the legislature is furious with me, and Speaker Lockhart and the rest, but I have, I hope, I think, an ability to say what I want without usually in a way that makes people laugh and isn't threatening. It isn't all of that serious. So people are able to accept that more than if you just kind of directly go after people. So I think that's been an asset to me. And I think it was on the radio, and I think it was on television, that people, they kind of put up with me.
Is that a skill you developed, or is that just how you came in your personality?
No, I studied joke books.
Seriously?
No.
No.
No, I don't know.
That was a joke, by the way.
Yeah, that was a joke. Sorry.
That was a meta joke.
Yeah, I'm sorry. No, I maybe it was a way, I had a grim childhood. Maybe it was just a way to, I remember staying over at my friend's house sometimes, and their mothers would come up 4 times and shake them and say, time to get up, and breakfast is waiting, and everything is, be sure, and you've got your money for lunch, and, it wasn't anything like that in my house. And I think, in a way, mothers, let your kids make their own damn breakfast, and I think they come out better for it. So I think maybe the personality kind of comes out of a combination of all these things. So maybe it's my parents. All
right. So this is going to do a great injustice to what I'm sure is a distinguished political career. Just give 30 seconds about what your ascension was to your current position. Did you start as, local stuff, state legislature?
No. I have a lot to say, as you can tell, and I'm off the radio, and my friends don't want to hear about it. And I was at a stoplight listening to the radio, and a car pulled up right next to me, and I was angry about whatever they were saying on the radio. So I motioned for the guy next to me to roll down his window, which he did, thinking I was going to ask directions. And I said, can you believe what that governor is doing over education funding? The guy looked at me and just sped off, without even answering or anything. So I have a lot of opinions. I have a lot to say, a lot to contribute, nobody actually to listen. And I thought, what better place for a person who's got a lot to say and not a lot of ideas than politics? And so that kind of motivated me that I'm getting old. It's time to kind of decide something. And I couldn't really get elected to anything that I thought. So I thought, well, what about state party chair? Nobody really wants to do that. And so I went around to all 29 counties, and they were to all the county conventions. I got in a little town in Iron County, and a guy came up to me. By then, when I announced, it was the gay guy is running as the state party chair, So got down there to this little town in Iron County, and there was 9 or 10 Democrats, and this guy came up to me and said, afterwards, he said, "I'm gay." And I said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "Yeah, but I don't dare tell anybody down here I'm gay." And I said, "Well, no, I can understand that." He said, "Yeah, if I tell them I'm gay, they're going to know I'm a Democrat." Nice. So I knew we were in the pecking order was all wrong there. So I did go around, went around all the counties, and
Okay, wait. So you never had a political career before?
No.
Seriously? Are you kidding me?
Are you trying to hurt me? What do you go back to?
All right. Well, then I'm just going to jump into it. Then, what does that say about the state of the Democratic Party in Utah? Sorry.
Let's get back to Peterson's handcuffs.
No. Okay, I'm gonna retract that question. But I'm gonna say this: how is it not a fool's errand to be a Democrat in Utah? We know the deck is stacked, except in Salt Lake City. We know how the elections are going to go. Why go through the trouble of running candidates that are going to lose by a 60% margin?
But I don't believe that. I think your premise is just dead wrong. I think that the Democrats are due for a huge resurgence here. I think the wackies have taken over the Republican Party. They've gone so far. Can you imagine saying Bob Bennett is too liberal? And I really believe, as I go around the state, it's a lot of Republicans that are whispering to me, "Save us, these people are crazy." And they've taken over their party. So I really believe we have a historic moment, an opportunity, even in Utah County, to go down and shake some things up. And the premise of what I'm trying to do is attract LDS people. 71.3% of Utah's population, according to the 2010 census, is LDS. 71%. 9% of active LDS people say they're Democrats, self-identified. It means we're going to lose elections as Democrats again and again and again until we reach out to LDS people. And I said at the convention before they elected me, here's one queer that is going to say to LDS people, we want you, we need you, we want your spirit in our party. We've got a big tent of diversity, which is what Democrats pride themselves on, and we're diverse. We have room for everybody, except in Utah for LDS people, which is crazy on a lot of levels. So we've started an LDS caucus to the horror of some. We are recruiting LDS candidates. We're going to, within our democratic beliefs and values, we're going to get LDS people involved. And the truth is, aside from the rhetoric, LDS values are a lot closer to Democrats than they are those blood-sucking Republican banker kind of people. And not that I'm outspoken on it.
So you've started to touch on it, but give a 1-minute appeal to a believing Latter-day Saint about what the main values are that the Democratic Party represents that resonates or harmonizes with traditional LDS beliefs. What are they? They
are hardworking, common sense kind of answers. You know, Republicans are just full with this Glenn Beck, crazy, loony theories, things that are ideological. And I think the LDS Church has been harmed in the United States of America by the belief that it has been captured by this political wacky ideology of the far right that makes even mainstream Republicans uncomfortable. So if you want to help your church, you should renounce this. You know, when somebody an investigator or a new LDS member arrives at their first Sunday in Oregon or in Florida or in Massachusetts, and they accept Joseph Smith, and they accept the First Vision, and they accept tithing, and they accept the fact they can't just come to church, they got to have a job. Now, in too many wards, they also get this whole kind of groupthink that is right-wing political thing, and they don't feel comfortable in that atmosphere, and the church loses them. And I think the church recognizes that, and that's one of the reasons why they are trying to work to get more Democrats, although they're not doing it directly.
Indirectly. So let's transition to what it would be like to work. What was that? Bravo? Bravo. Should we clap for? Yeah. Okay. So let's go to what it would be like to work with the LDS Church to try and advocate for some pro-LGBT legislation. Whatever history or interesting stories or tactics you want to talk about how that in the world would ever be possible.
15 years ago, after some very grim personal experiences, I went to Michelle Turpin, who was my friend and a lawyer. And I said, Michelle, I would like to give some money to help a gay cause in Utah, so will you kind of look around? And so she looked around, and I had said, what about the Gay and Lesbian Center? And she, it was in effect kind of non-functioning. They were over on 3rd West, and their executive director had left, and there was a large tax bill, and they were about to lose their lease, and it wasn't working. So Michelle, mostly Michelle, organized a bus tour where we invited a lot of LDS or LGBT people with money, and we took a bus tour among 4 or 5 horrible sites and said, we're going to start a new center, and we need money from you guys. And we brought them to all these horrible places, and then we brought them to the one that was expensive, which is where the Pride Center is now. We said, nobody can leave the bus till we have enough money to start this thing. And a lot of wonderful people put the money down, and we also had some alcohol on the bus, which may have had something to do with it. So we started that Pride Center, and as soon as we did, I was the chair, and I wrote a letter to the LDS Church, and I said, you know, we're all here. It's a wonderful time. It's a beautiful city. Why don't we get together and find some commonality? And a letter came rolling back about a week later that said, we have nothing to talk to the so-called gays about. So, and I've kept that letter. And
this is 95-ish?
Yeah, and we kept that letter, and I have presented that in the face of my good friends now and said, you signed this. Okay, so we did that letter. So then, let's see, about 2001, and the Pride Center flourished. As soon as I left, it flourished, which is a pattern of things after
Democrats in 2015.
Yeah, there. Put your money there. Exactly. So the Pride Center did really well, and I was asked by our incoming mayor, Rocky Anderson, who had been my lawyer, if I would be on a small business committee. And he said, I said, Rocky, I don't do well on committees. I don't want to do this. And he said, Jim, I'm not asking you as your lawyer. I'm asking you as the mayor. I said, Rocky, all right, I'll be on the small business committee. So it needed a city council approval. And there's a process where the city council approves this. And there was like 50 of these. It's very kind of, it just happens automatically. I mean, it's a volunteer thing. They're just happy to have bodies and everything filled. So to make a long story short, there was one city councilman who will remain nameless, Dave Bueller, and Dave decided that a guy like me should not be representing the city, because by then I was kind of out and had done the Pride Center. So Rocky, who was young and naive, said, look, Councilman Bueller, once he knows you, he's going to say fine, and it'll all be approved, and there won't be any problem at all. So Rocky invited Mayor Anderson invited me and Councilman Bueller into his office, and Bueller stood there and said, "We cannot have somebody like him representing the city." And I said, "Rocky, he's right. I don't want to be on this committee. The city should not have somebody like me representing." Rocky got furious. His face, like a cartoon character, just got redder and redder, and I thought he was going to pop off, and he said, "You will serve!" So I said, "Okay, Rocky, we'll go." And Bueller stormed out, and I stormed out, and that was the end of it. And I called Rocky, and I said, "Look, this is not a Supreme Court seat. I don't want to do this anyway." So I didn't do it, but then I drove around, and it started to make me angry, and I thought, this was an insult to me, but to everybody who's LGBT. That just is wrong. And so we sat down and started Equality, Utah, with 4 or 5 wonderful people.
At that same Village Inn.
Exactly. So I wrote another letter to the church. So this would have been 4 or 5 years after the first one. It took 9 months for the letter to come back this time, so they were thinking.
They thought about it.
Yeah, and I had asked the same thing, and this time the letter came back and it said, "We see no reason to meet with the so-called homosexuals. Thank you." And that was the end of it.
Same letter.
It's basically the same letter. So now we've got to zoom ahead from then, which is 10 years ago, to the weekend after the first kiss-in, which Troy organized back there.
What year was that?
This is right after Prop 8, so 2008, so 2009.
2008, 2009.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So I was just driving along.
Not a politician.
No, I'm just a normal guy with opinions. And so I was driving along, the phone rang. They said, "Hi, we would like to meet." I said, "Who is this?" I said, "Well, this is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints." And I said, "Come on, So we got well, where should we meet? Should we meet at the Joseph Smith building? Should we meet at the Gay and Lesbian Coffee Shop? Oh no, that wouldn't be good on a lot of grounds, So finally, I happened to be going to my good friends, Sam and Diane Stewart's, who have a lovely home on the Avenues. They are very LDS, but very, very close friends of Stephen and mine. And we happened to be going there, and it was a party, and I grabbed Diane, pulled her in the bathroom, and said, "Diane, could I meet the church here?" And just then, somebody walked in the bathroom and went, "Oh," like that. No. So Diane said yes, the Stewarts, and I said to the church, "Look, I'm uncomfortable. I'm not anybody now. I'm not on the board of the center. I'm not in the board with Equality, but I know those people, so I can arrange things."
Why'd they contact you?
I think it was from the letter. That's what I said to him. So is this from the letter 12 years ago or from the letter 6 years ago? No laughing. No, nothing. No, it was actually Dita Seed, the city council person, who had given them my name. I found out subsequently. So I arranged for the head of the Pride Center, the head of Equality, John Jepson, because he's a great guy and he looks just like a missionary, and he'd been a counselor in the bishopric, and he was also a homosexual. And Stephanie Pappas, who was the chair. So the 5 of us met. It was very hot. So as we were pulling in there to this, and it's a beautiful house. I mean, it's a gorgeous house, Sam and Diane. I mean, they have a Georgia O'Keeffe there that costs more than my net worth. I mean, it's a beautiful house. And that I'm only saying that because it's important to what happens next. So we got there. It was 180 degrees. And as we were going in, I decided I'm going to look the part, because President McKay said, "Whate'er thou art, act well thy part." And I thought, I'm meeting with the church
Good
guys.
Mormon boy.
So I put on a white shirt. I had the suit on. And the church guys pulled up at the same time, and they were all dressed like that. And I said, "You guys, look, if you take the coat off, I will." And there was our first agreement. We all took our coats off, left them in the car. We went into Diane's house. They didn't know me. I didn't know them. Everybody was kind of sitting around. And so you got to imagine this incredibly elegant, beautiful home and this beautiful living room. And I said to them, trying to break the atmosphere, look, I hope it's okay, but I told Brother and Sister Stewart that if they let us use their house for our first historic meeting, that you would lower their tithing to 6%. Well, you would have thought I would have said something bad about the Book of Mormon. I mean, these guys just went kind of white, and I said, no, just kidding. Oh, all right. So we sat down and we started to talk, and what had been originally going to be a 45-minute meeting turned into 2 hours. And at the end, we said, well, should we meet again? And they said, yes. And I thought, a month or two. And they said, no, next week. And so it began a long, wonderful, life-changing series of meetings that have, I think, had a tremendous effect. They have on me personally, but I think they have on the lives of the LDS people that we have met with.
So, if there was someone now who had some occasion to have audience with church leadership today, what types of advice or recommendations would you make in having that be a constructive and potentially a productive set of conversations?
Well, one of the byproducts, I think, of our discussions was the Salt Lake City Ordinance. The ordinance would have passed anyway, but we said to the church, and they recognized this, that it's hard for the church just to come out with a statement about LGBT issues. There needs to kind of be some kind of issue, and with Salt Lake City having this ordinance come up, it would be natural that the church would therefore make some kind of a statement. So it was a natural flow, and what the statement would be was what was interesting. But I think the message ought to be, look at the good, look at the change, look at what's happening. Look over the last 20 or 30 years, and you'll see tremendous change. Look at the evolution of the life of a BYU student, from you even think you're homosexual and you are not only thrown out of school, your credit's destroyed, we'll call your parents and your bishop and do all we can to destroy your life, and we may try to arrest you. Under the Wilkinson era, I mean, it was grim. It was J. Edgar Hoover. It was listening devices. It was awful. To now, where I went down recently to talk to the editorial board at the Daily Universe on something, and enjoyed lunch at the Wilkinson Center. And there must have been 10, I was with a gay student, and there must have been 10 or 12 gay students who came over and talked and kind of hugged each other in a very LGBT way. And nobody seemed to take particular notice, or the students didn't seem to be threatened. Is there a way to go? Of course, but you have to measure these things in decades, and you have to look at the long picture. And the arc of history, as Martin Luther King said, is slow, but it favors justice. And the church is a big organization. There's a lot of personalities. Everything has to be done with unanimity, which means the speed of what goes on to a certain extent at the rate of the most conservative person in the decision-making process. So on that kind of scale, I think what's happened over the last 2 or 3 years in particular has been phenomenal, and I'm tremendously optimistic.
Was there a cynical part of you that said that the church was trying to save face from Prop 8 and a lot of PR disasters, and this was just, you were kind of helping them to kind of regain some cred that they may have lost?
in life, I try to look at the results and not the motivation, because it's impossible to figure out really the motivation in any other person. We can't even figure out the motivation in ourselves most of the time. So you can only look really at the concrete results. That statement is there. It's hard, it's fast, and the church has even added on to it. Recently, they added some adjectives to what they said on vis-a-vis the Salt Lake City ordinance that said the church strongly and boldly, those weren't the exact words, stands behind its statement on non-discrimination. I think that's about where we need to be, and I expect even greater things to happen. But we have to be patient, we have to be realistic, we have to recognize it's a big institution, it's a large battleship, and battleships take a while to change course.
Do you have a vision someday for how LGBTs might be treated in the church, or for what types of other changes you think the church might make? Do you have kind of the mountaintop that you've seen and we may get there?
No, I'm not a mountaintop guy. I just think that, I talked to Carol Lynn Pearson, who's one of my great heroes, and she keeps me informed about what's going on in the Bay Area wards, where there's tremendous change. And that change does not happen without at least a nod from Salt Lake City. So when a openly gay man is serving in a bishopric as a ward clerk, and it makes headlines, if he would have been released the next day or the next week or the next month, then we might have realized that it was a mistake. But what's happening there and the outreach to LGBT people is not a mistake. And I spoke to a bunch of political science kids at BYU, and 3 or 4 of the questions were out and out LGBT questions. And I said, okay, who's for gay marriage here? And there was a lot of kids in the class, and no hands went up. And I said, okay, who's for civil unions? And a few hands went up. And I said, okay, who's for anti-discrimination in housing and in employment? And virtually every hand went up. I mean, this generational thing is something that will pass, and it will be looked upon as a peculiar, weird moment in old-time history, I think. And we're already seeing the change. I'm tremendously optimistic.
Beautiful. Who's Steve?
Steve is, I don't know. We have been together 26 years, and frankly, it's too long. I'm looking for somebody younger.
All right. I'll talk to my wife.
Okay.
Just kidding. So, back to that experience, one last thing. What in the world was transformative for you, personally or spiritually, in those negotiations and talks? How in the world could you come out ahead? You come out ahead from those negotiations?
Because there was a human face. I mean, I feel like it would be betraying some confidences, but it seems to me there was a moment where we talked about Prop 8. And the gist of the discussion was to put it was for us not personal. We were not attacking people. There was a principle. It was a legal issue. It was nothing personal. But meeting you and seeing the face and seeing your relationships and seeing children in your families, you actually love your kids as much as everybody else. It it stopped being the issue of, okay, here's marriage on its pedestal, and here's some kind of another relationship, and how close can we allow these two things to get without this being contaminated? A very legal, a very philosophical, a non-personal issue at all. But suddenly, from their point of view, I think meeting, aside from me, a pretty good group of people, and to some extent getting involved in their lives, personalized it. And it worked the other way. Let me tell you what happened. The Sunday after Troy caused all those problems with the kiss-in, which I opposed. No, I love the kiss-in. There was another kiss-in that somebody else put on. And by then, we'd already had one meeting. And they called me and said, Jim, will you come down here? Brother Dabakis is what they said. Will you come down here? So I went down there. So it was this very interesting moment where I was standing there in the plaza with my new church friends, and cars were lined up, and people were kissing. They'd broken through the barricades, kind of. And people were screaming obscenities out their windows at me and at my church guy. And I was appalled. I said, hey, wait a minute, well, you don't know me. And they would say, oh, blah, 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 blah. Well, I flipped one of them off, which was, and I've got to say, that guy was astonished that this church guy would do that, or at least it got all mixed up. But I began, and we began to see that it's not quite as easy as, okay, why doesn't the 12 just get together and do all of this? It's a large bureaucracy. They have constituencies. There's a lot of complexity to all of this. So it's not to make excuses. It's just to understand reality. And so when the church, for the first year, invited the 5 of us and our 5 partners to the Joseph Smith building, to the Tabernacle Choir broadcast, and where they met all of our partners and hugged them, and then we walked from the Joseph Smith building across the plaza where they said, okay, anybody want to kiss? No problem. into the big building there, to the VIP seats where there's delegation of homos at the invitation of the church was sitting there, and I sat next to the Senate President Waddups, and I couldn't wait to say to him, so I'm here with homosexuals. Who are you here with? So it has changed me. I'm sure it's changed all of the 5, and I want to believe that it also has had an effect in the church. And we just need really to be tolerant. We need to recognize the other person's position to some extent. And it's going to go back and forth. There's going to be eruptions. There's going to be times when the more conservative elements within the church win a battle. I mean, look what happened a couple of conferences ago when Elder Packer said what he said. But look what happened on the other end. You know, within 2 or 3 days, President Uchtdorf stood up and, in effect, reprimanded him. Now, there's problems. 10 o'clock session of conference gets out to millions and millions of people, and that will stick with them. And the kind of withdrawing it from the official General Conference report and then saying it in a regional conference without television is different, but nonetheless, that's a very difficult thing to be done. And so you have to look at the totality of where we are, where we've been, where are we going, where are the trends, who are the personalities, and when I see that, I see a lot of sunshine.
Beautiful. We always end in typical Mormon Stories fashion asking our
testimony.
How'd you know? Were you kidding?
No, yes, I am kidding.
That is actually how we end Mormon Stories interviews.
No, is it?
Except we don't, of course, expect an orthodox testimony from anybody. So what we ask is people just to end by sharing. I'll ask you to do two things. I want you to share what you believe in most in life. What are the guiding principles or pillars of your life that are meaningful and true to you? And then I want to ask you to do your best to motivate our listeners, which are in the tens of thousands at this point. A lot of them aren't sure what they think about this issue. If you wanted to make an appeal for either empathy or activism in whatever way people are able, I want you to make that appeal as you close. Take us to the mountaintop, even though you're not a mountaintop guy.
Yeah, I'm not a mountaintop guy. I think they're the same for me. And I think it is to live your passion. If you're muddling through life without any passion, you have to question your existence. You know, figure something out, whether it's pets or model trains or Glee or, you know, sports or something, and get some passion. It gives you a reason to get up. It gives you a reason for your heart to continue beating. And whatever it is, pick out something and get passionate about it. I hope it has to do with LGBT rights, but pick something that is your passion and then stay with it. Give yourself a reason to get up and be optimistic. Look, we have come so far. Don't get discouraged with these bumps in the road. They're going to come. Believe me, they're going to come. But don't lose track of the far-sightedness of where we've come and where we're going. Recognize that we are on the good side of history, and it's going to happen. That's all.
That's all. Beautiful.
This podcast was brought to you today by Mormon Stories Podcast and by the Open Stories Foundation. To learn more about LDS homosexuality, please check out gaymormonstories.org. Music on today's podcast was brought to you by the Saber Rattlers. Take care.
Sounding to us and each nation, and shortly the hour of redemption will come, when all that was promised the saints will be given, and none will molest them from morning till eve, and earth will appear as the Garden of Eden, and Jesus will say to all Israel, come